Okay, well, why don't we get stuck in with today's session, Perfect Your Test Data Strategy, how to achieve software quality and compliance at speed. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our two expert speakers today. So first, we've got Ben Riley, Curiosity's Chief Revenue Officer. So I've had the pleasure of working with Ben for the best part of the last 10 years, during which time he's really specialised as a DevOps and test data consultant. So I've seen Ben transform test data practices at the world's largest enterprises in healthcare, banking, finance, insurance, and beyond. So today, he's going to share his formula for enterprise test data success with you. We also have Lena Dethridge, who's a solutions engineer at Curiosity. So Lena really works at the pointy end of test data modernization. You know, she works with the world's largest enterprises to implement the latest techniques in test data automation. And today she's going to demo to you live the approaches that she's found to be most effective in unblocking software development pipelines. So do stay put for Lena's live demo, and then we will be having a live Q&A with both Ben and Lena. Now, before I hand over to Ben to get going, I'd like just to take a look at the results we've got from our poll today. So thanks everybody for voting. We wanted to get to know you and your organisation a little bit, and we asked which capabilities best describe your current practices. And the results are quite interesting, actually. I mean, half of you, your organisation understands your data very well. About 17% is using raw production data in non-production environments. 8% using mass production. About a quarter using synthetically generated data. None of you are virtualizing your data for non-production, and less than 10% have on-demand provisioning there. So I guess, Ben, Lena, as we get going, looking at those poll results, how does that align with your understanding of the market, and where would you say our sort of audience is in relation to that?
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? So I think raw production data in non-production places, something maybe we definitely want to get past, and we'll talk to some of the other topics as we kind of get on through today. So and I feel there are a few synthetic folks out there, so that's always good to see. So let's talk about it. Let's get into it, and we'll see where we end up.
Fantastic, great stuff. So I'll hand over to you then, Ben. Yeah, thanks for the session.
Perfect, good. So let me just share my screen, and we will get into it. So thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Just, I guess, two classic questions. One, let's just make sure you can see my screen okay.
All good.
Perfect. Thank you, Lena. So I guess just to run through the format, right? So we're going to just talk a few slides, just talking about sort of some of the strategies that we see and some of the processes to kind of take that strategy forward. I think just another important thing is, much like this is maybe writing a recipe, and there are different orders and adding flavors and ingredients and the rest of it. Lena is going to actually show some of the ways to kind of approach this, to bake that cake, so to speak. So you'll get a bit of both worlds in here, but just to talk, why we're here, why we're talking about it. We see a tremendous sort of opportunity when it comes to test data, primarily around the fact that most organizations, but especially enterprise organizations, do struggle with sort of strategic planning and being able to tackle a lot of the problems that they see. And we kind of split those up into a couple of different areas around quality, risk, security, in terms of your data and environments that you're sort of working in, and then growing those into what we I call level 1 and level 2 problems, but more around the scarcity and realism of data that you're able to use, the understanding of that data, how you go about getting data out of production or generating into a non-production environment and the rest of it, and then actually using it, right? So there's all sorts of different themes that we sort of talk to, but ultimately you're trying to do it for a series of benefits. These are problems that if you solve them, albeit some simple stuff around compliance and making sure you are GDPR compliant and those sorts of things in terms of your environments, but also from a quality and efficiency and a maintainability perspective, right? You want your teams to be efficient, you want them to be able to do good, if not better, testing. You want to sort of be moving to a more preventative model when it comes to fixing bugs and that sort of stuff. And the more that you can enable people, the more that people can do it themselves, the better, right? It sort of all adds up. So I'm just going to talk to this journey. Now, it's for most organizations quite a chaotic start that hopefully ends in sort of something that is quite simple. But it is important to understand that most organizations, when it comes to their sort of their test data strategy, typically start off in a level of chaos, then move and sort of, progressively over time reduce that down. There is no magic green button that it just fixes everything, right? But it is important to understand that, as long as you are tackling this, that chaos will reduce, that complexity will then potentially become less complicated. And there's a few ideas here that we'll kind of walk through and talk about, especially when it comes to where to start. Are we doing the right things? So on and so forth. Hopefully getting to a point where it does become much more simple, that your unknown unknowns become more understood, more known, and you actually get to a position where you can tackle and provide people a much better service when it comes to their sort of data requirements. So phase one, we sort of pulled this into three phases really. The first one is very much about understanding and learning. So that first poll, that first question on people, I think there was a reasonable majority saying that their understanding of their data is pretty good. I would question whether that's just their knowledge, their SME knowledge, or whether they've applied tooling, if they've got standards, if they've got, when new team members join their team, how they sort of transfer that knowledge and make sure that everybody is on a reasonable playing field. But we'll kind of talk to it. For us, there's a process here, and you may have done some of these things, you may be doing some of these things, but just to call a couple of them out, right? Understanding your current process, teams, tools, how you interact today, get a baseline is really important. Trying to understand what is valuable to your teams. Like, what are you trying to deliver? Like, is it you've got a pretty good service and we want to maintain, or is it not so good and we want to get better? There's normally some key sort of value deliverables that you're trying to get to there. And also, essentially, what are we deeming as sensitive? People talk about sensitive data quite a lot, I think, in tests. So is that commercially sensitive, personally sensitive? What is it? Is it just that you haven't got enough data quality in there? Really trying to understand that little cycle of three is really important. Who's going to be who from your teams is going to be important is another one, and actually starting that process, right? So for us, stage one is very much about building blocks. Sometimes it gets referred to as data profiling, sometimes it's data cataloging or data modeling, but ultimately for a typical test environment like this one on here, could be a mixture of new systems, old systems, various different databases, different file types, different scripts, whatever it might be. But for us, you've got to spend as much time here as possible, really, because for most test teams and most testing, the actual understanding of the systems that are in play, the relationships that exist, is quite a hard thing to understand, and the impact of changing those things or cataloging those things is huge, because it gives you a structure, it gives you a baseline, it gives you the ability to sort of hopefully understand more about that system than you currently know. And we see a huge value in doing this. To typically anything that you can automate in this space to save a huge amount of time, but it also allows you to truly understand the impact of change. So when system A, a new deployment goes out, or a new deployment is about to go out, then actually you've got a much more structured approach and understanding of what's about to change. And therefore, if something breaks, potentially looking back to understand what the differences were, to sort of hone in on some of that root cause analysis and hopefully keep people out of war rooms and all of that sort of stuff. We also find visualizing it, modeling potentially some of those particular details is a really useful way of providing insight, especially when it comes to what you're actually delivering and deploying and so on and so forth. Once you've done that understanding, and that phase will take much longer, than those slides kind of go through, people will typically want to talk about the implementation, right? Which is absolutely fine. There's a variety of ways that you can go to. I've called out three that I've seen inside organizations that typically start with, and we'll talk about the pros and cons as we go through. Masking is typically the first one, right? So people taking a copy of production, masking it and loading it into non-production environments. You do this to avoid fines. You make sure you do it so that actually that perception that I think a lot of people have, which is production data is good to test with, I would query that, right, in terms of does it give you enough of the right data, and is it broken enough for your test environments? You want a different type of data, I would say, in test, but it is a method, and I think most people understand where that method sort of comes from. You got to make sure you're doing it right. You got to make sure you're maintaining quality. You got to make sure that you're securing it correctly. Can be quite easy at times if you do a bad job of masking to reverse engineer it. So you've got to make sure that all of those things are lined up. But masking data is a reasonable start. We would, and as part of that poll, I think a few people mentioned that they're into the world of synthetic. We'd typically say that absolutely fine. It's a super powerful way of being able to ensure that security risk doesn't happen. It's all synthetically generated. It can take a little bit longer to get going. It can take you a little bit longer to understand that system in more detail, to understand the type of data that you want. But typically it becomes reusable. You can create as much or as little data as you need, so it's useful from a sizing and scaling perspective. And actually, we find that once you've been through that understanding process, you get huge efficiencies by creating synthetic data generation jobs. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, but it's for some people it can be a little bit scary, right? Like you have to make data from scratch. Is it going to be right? So on and so forth. So totally fine. The one that I think, or a piece about this that I think maybe helps understand why synthetic potentially a little bit more valuable, is that if you apply certain techniques, and for us we use modeling as one of the ideas here, you can create incredibly rich sets of data to go and test with. So highly covered in terms of your system under test. If you understand the requirements of what's being delivered, you can make sure that all of your multiplications of different types of data are there and covered, which in production you typically can't, right? Hopefully production works, and therefore it has quite a slim profile. Synthetic data gives you that ability to be more flexible, and if you understand your requirements, it's incredibly powerful, right? So you can get yourself nice covered databases, files, whatever it might be, with hopefully still maintaining sort of a level of not needing too much of it. You don't want massive databases and infrastructure costs and all that sort of stuff. So it's a nice little best of both worlds. The final piece that I would suggest typically get started with is actually finding that data. We find that for most testers, they spend a ton of time trying to find, or even, they might call it prepping their own data. But actually, it takes them ages. You need to find somebody, you got to find a particular, whatever it is, savings account with a certain, whatever it is, ISO standard behind it. It needs to be in a particular system at a particular time. It's difficult, right? Most people, the reason Google exists, right, is because it's very easy for people to just go on and search for something that they're trying to understand. Most people don't have a Google for their own application, right? And what they do have are maybe pre-created sheets of information that they hope nobody else finds out about or uses or steps on. So for me, looking at a system that allows you to essentially create your own internal Google and be able to find the data that you need that matches that test, matches that use, whatever it might be, essentially lets tests pass or fail for the right reason, right? You want tests to fail because something in the application is wrong, not because the data is out of date or not quite what we're after. So those are three things that I would suggest, and as we talk about this, Lena's going to walk through some of these and show some of these in action. But I think it is important just to talk about how you actually get going and start this implementation. So for me, these are stage 1 and stage 2, what we've spoken about. Stage 3 does become more about self-service. It does potentially start to investigate some of the database virtualizations or tying some of these stages together, right? And potentially spending more time in stage 1 and early stage 2 about learning and understanding versus just being in a rush to go and deliver something. Because that if you automate that understanding piece nicely, it sets everything else up for real sort of progression. But as part of that, you've got to talk to how do you actually do it, right? Is it better for you to set up a center of excellence? Is it better to go for visual standards? What does a typical test data project look for you internally in terms of doing that? For me, mutually agreeing with your project teams, with your center of excellence, that it is about being accountable. It is about growing those services over time with realistic expectations, and then also getting as much feedback as you can. From team to team, from project to project, your data requirements change, your teams change, and so actually that journey changes. But try to keep it, let's call it within reason, mutually sort of close together. That gives you reusable assets, gives you a ton of sort of very valuable assets, but in a way that you can, with a little bit of rework, reuse a lot of those things. I think it's also really important to establish some metrics. So right to that initial talking about what's valuable, what is that? Is that usage? Is it the number of things that you can deliver? Is it lower bugs? What's a success metric for you? Because you want to be able to prove that actually you're going in the right or going in the wrong direction, right? So you can correct those things. You do need structured training. You want to make sure that everybody is utilizing your services, your test data services, in a sensible way. And I would always say, be loud about the successes that your team's doing, because quite often people get lost in their own worlds, right? And it gets quite hard to understand, what that team's doing, why they're being successful, and maybe we're not, or we're doing some really good stuff. We want to shout about it to everybody. So it is important so people can understand that there is more in this space that you can kind of potentially do and get on with. And so too many slides already. So I would say, let's get into a demo. I will pause, ask Tom during that. Any questions come in? Anything you want to ask before we get into Lena showing bits and pieces?
No, not currently. So a reminder that you can get questions to both Ben and Lena by using the chat box there. But I think let's have a demo. Let's see what it looks like in practice, and then we'll loop back around to a live Q&A at the end.
Great, sounds good. So thank you, Ben, for that introduction. So hopefully you can see my screen now. And for today's demo, we'll be going through how we could use the 3-step process we outlined with the real world example. So we'll be walking through this journey with the main character of our story, Tina. Tina recently got hired as a test data engineer at the company Digital Bank Incorporated. And she's really excited to start this role because she's been a customer of Digital Bank for a long time. Her whole family uses their services, and she often recommends them to her friends. So she's looking forward to having an opportunity to contribute to the quality of the online platform there. So it's Tina's first day, and the office HR lets her know that her manager is unfortunately out sick. They show her to her desk, and she logs into her email for the first time. And she sees that there's an urgent email to the test data group in her inbox. And it's from the testing team, who is responsible for implementing a new feature inside of their platform. As part of their testing, they need test data that would validate certain business rules. And specifically, they need users that have a credit limit of $2,000 to test the amount they're able to deposit inside of a new checking account system. Unfortunately, this request is quite urgent because the sprint finishes tomorrow. Thankfully, Tina is quite familiar with the enterprise test data platform Digital Bank uses because she used it in her previous role. So let's walk through how she's going to generate the test data her team needs in order to test the new application, keeping the 3 pillars in mind. So first, our data will need to be compliant. So it cannot be production data, and it cannot contain personal identifiable information. And secondly, our testing team needs their data fast and will most likely need it again in the future if they're ever going to retest. And lastly, we'll need to have good quality data. So it needs to accurately represent the conditions we are trying to test. So with this scenario in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the platform and walk through this example. All right, so here we are inside of the enterprise test data platform, and Tina's first step will be to understand what sort of data they currently have. And her goal by understanding this data is to know where the sensitive data is, and also to use her understanding of the database to generate realistic synthetic data later on. So here we have a connection to our SQL Server database of our digital bank. So we created a new connection to our database by entering in the credentials. And from here, we're able to perform a scan. And this scan will crawl through the database and create a definition, which is a snapshot of our database at a given point in time. So let's go ahead and switch over to our scanned definition. So in our definition view, we could see the schema of the database, and we could see all of the tables that it contains as well as the columns. So as we open these up here, we can see the relationships that exist inside of these tables. So we could see the primary keys as well as any foreign keys existing inside of each table. And you might see here that we also have some tags placed on these columns. And these tags were assigned columns based off of our scan. So the scan, using several different criteria, was able to identify each of these columns as potentially containing sensitive information. And based on our configuration, we were able to place different tags on those individual columns. So inside of our account, we have these tags here for our sensitive information, but for today, we're interested in our users. So here is the user profile section. So for example, we could see that our address was tagged as containing addresses, so we would want to mask this. And one thing that would be worth mentioning is that the scanning process is entirely customizable to fit industry needs. So in this example, we'll be using banking standards, but we can absolutely customize this to meet your needs. And these tags will also be important later on, as they'll allow us to rapidly create synthetic test data on these columns. We can also look at our database in another way by using diagrams. And we have different types of diagrams to help us visualize our data and get a different perspective. So here, let's go ahead and move on over to our entity relationship diagram. So this transformed that table view we were just looking at into a diagram where we can see instantly how the tables are related to one another. So at a glance, we could see the parent-child relationships as well as any foreign keys and primary keys. So for example, we could see our users table, and then we have our user profile table here, so we could easily see what the relationships are inside of our database. Another similar view that we could take of our database is the radial partition diagram. And we can use this to see what tables are directly related to another table that we're interested in. So for example, we could see that the users table is related to quite a few other tables, and that the data we generate could potentially have a lot of impact across our database. So now that we've understood our data a bit more and we've located where our sensitive data is and we know what data we need to create, Tina can now move on to the next step, which is going to be generation. So we're going to move on over to masking. So Tina wants to mask the PII that she found inside of those columns for the user table. So the first step she'll do inside of the enterprise test data platform is to create a data activity. And this activity, once it's been built, can be reused in the future whenever she needs to mask the same data. So first, she went ahead and added her database connection that we saw earlier that's already been scanned, and that definition that contains all of the tags that she's interested in. This will specify exactly which data will be masked. And the next step would be to apply rules on top of those columns that we identified in order to synthetically generate our data. So we'll go ahead and look at the next tab, which is going to be our masking rule set. So here inside of our rule set, we have our user profile table, which we're interested in masking. And on each of the columns, you'll now see that we have a masking function assigned to it. And these functions will allow us to synthetically generate test data right into our database. So let's go ahead and open up the masking function we have for our address here. And currently, we have over 200 functions built right into the platform that you can use out of the box. So we just select what type of action that you want to place on top. So for example, we have different categories based on industries or types of synthetic generation data that we typically find companies needing, such as addresses. And from there, once we select the exact type of function we want to use, we can select specific function itself. So in this case, I want to generate a full street address. I'll go ahead and select that function. And if there are any parameters associated with your function, you can then specify it here. So for now, we'll go ahead and leave our parameters as is. And once we click OK, we now have a rule applied on top of our column that's going to generate that data for us upon execution. So let's go ahead and move on down to our email address here. So we can also cross-reference data within the same table, across tables, and also between databases. So for the email example, we'll want to generate a synthetic email. However, we'll want to make sure that the names and last names that people commonly use in their email addresses match the synthetic versions of those, not the original PII. So in this parameter section, I went ahead and referenced existing columns inside of our schema. So in this case, we went ahead and referenced the table that contains the first name parameter as well as the last name. So when we generate the test data for this email, it's going to contain the synthetically generated versions of these criteria. Once we have all of our masking functions overlaid on top of the user profile table, we can then go ahead and move back over to our data activity. And now we're ready to execute this and actually mask our database. So here we have our server process that will execute that action against the database. So go ahead and click on that. And we have the option of creating an audit report at this stage, which would just allow us to check to make sure the data is being generated in a way that we would expect. So we'll go ahead and check that box. And we'll go ahead and just do a small number of batches to audit. And we'll validate our masking rules. But for this example, we won't necessarily update the database. So now with all of our job parameters specified, we can go ahead and execute this task. So that task has now kicked off, and I did prepare a version of this ahead of time that we can go ahead and take a look into specifically for those audit reports. So I'll switch over to our finished version here, which provided a total of 18 rows updated inside of our database, and we can download the results to take a look at them. So here are the audit results of our masking job. So we can have all of those columns that contain the sensitive information, and we also have the pre as well as post masking values. So this is for us to really just double check and make sure the data generated is what we want. So we can see that the addresses generated look great. All of the personally identifiable information from earlier is now covered. So we all have fake date of births, email addresses, names, as well as phone numbers and social security numbers. So with this audit report, we're now confident that our masking rules are working as expected, and we can now mask the database as is. So like Ben mentioned, masking is a really starting point for a lot of organizations trying to come with a new test data strategy. So with masking, we're meeting regulatory compliances and we have data that is realistic enough to test. Also, by reducing the data that is brought into testing environments, we're also minimizing the risk of data breaches in general. However, masking isn't the end all be all of test data management. So we take this a step further by generating all data synthetically. So masking is really a narrowed scope of synthetic data generation, and full synthetic generation can replicate the patterns and behaviors found in an application. So just like masking, it's realistic yet preserves privacy, and there's additional benefits to synthetically generating all of your test data. So for example, production data isn't always high coverage, and with synthetic test data, you can create those outliers and rare data or those edge cases that are typically missed. And synthetically creating all of your data gives you the benefits of fast, compliant, and quality data while also eliminating the risk of using production data at all. So let's say that Tina wanted to take this a step further and synthetically generate an entire table. Let's go ahead and jump back into the platform. And this time around, we're going to take a look at other data activity that's going to synthetically generate all of the rows inside of a particular table. So here, just like before, we have our building blocks, which is our connection to our database, as well as the scanned definition. And let's go ahead and take a look into the actual rules. So here we're generating all of the columns for the table account type. And you'll see like before, we have those tags that specify whether these originally contained personally identifiable information. And we have on the right-hand side here, all of our rules that are generating the possible synthetic test data that we want to create for these columns. So just like before, we can open up our editing menu and choose a function from our category lists in order to generate the data. And one thing is if you have a large database, probably going in and doing each one of these columns individually, it would be a bit too slow of a process. So there is a way to speed that up, and it's by using these tags here. So whenever we have a tag placed on a column, we can also apply a global rule across your workspace where we apply a function to every column that contains a particular name or tag. And we call this feature global defaults. So I'll go ahead and show what the global defaults look like. So inside of our workspace here in our general menu, we have a full list of global defaults for this workspace. So if we scroll to the bottom here, we can see that we have a lot of tags that are set to equal a certain value. And whenever they meet this criteria, they would then apply the appropriate synthetic test data generation. So for example, for any tag equal to the tag amount, we have selected to apply generation rules. And specifically, we want to apply this function every single time this instance occurs inside of our workspace. So we could set this up in the backend ahead of time in order to help speed up our process. And once we're ready to apply the tags, we could go back into our table and we'll go ahead and select Apply Defaults. And in this particular table, we have these options available. So this matched, for example, the global default of any tag equaling amount. And we can choose here whether or not we want to apply that default onto this column to generate test data. So that covers our two steps, which are first understanding your data and then also creating your test data. But now we can move on to the third step, which is implementing or deploying this out to your whole team. So for this example, we're going to go ahead and move on to another data activity, which is the find and reserve. So in this data activity, we'll ensure that the team we're providing the data for not only gets the right data, but also gets it at the right time. Like before, we went ahead and added components to our activity to build up our foundation. So here we have our connection as well as our rules and our definition. And then we've also created a job that can be executed using a customized form. So just like in masking, when we selected the criteria we wanted to execute, we could do this across all of our data activities. And the really great thing about this is it could be turned into a form that you can embed into places such as a Confluence page or anywhere that accepts iframes. That way, you don't necessarily need to have all of your engineers accessing this data activity. They can provision it in whichever software that they would expect to find their test data in. So let's go ahead and open up that form. So in this form, if we think back to our very first slide where we're talking about the situation, we need to find customers with a specific credit limit of $2,000 in order to test the rest of the new checking account system. So here we can select how many of those users we want to find, and then we can go ahead and type in the credit limit. So let's go ahead and put 2,000. And we'll call this use case name checking account. And lastly, we can go ahead and choose to reserve this data for a number of days. So this is really helpful to making sure that your test data isn't used up by another testing team and it's going to behave the way that you expect. So we can allocate this specifically for Tina's testing team. So we'll go ahead and leave this as 10, and then we can go ahead and execute the form from here. However, there are actually a couple of other options that we can do at this stage. So like we just talked about, we can also embed this job as a iframe. And the most common place to do this that we've found with our clients is inside of Confluence. So we went ahead and picked this iframe here for this job. and we put it inside of our Confluence as a form that now users can interact with, and they can actually execute that same exact job directly from this Confluence page. So this is a great way of just externalizing our forms and being able to use it with a wider team, and they're able to provision test data on demand now. Another option we have is to embed this as code. So we could do that in two ways. We could do it either as a API request where we're submitting a job, and then we can also do it as just code inside of a test script, for example. So here we have our code that we can implement in, as well as our post for this API request. So let's take a look at what this would actually look like. So I prepared a test script which would execute against the digital bank platform, and it's going to test that new UI of the checking account system. So if we scroll up here, in our before suite, we went ahead and embedded our API call. And specifically, we're going to be getting the response of the user ID that we want to use. So this would be the valid user. So let's go ahead and kick off this test. And we'll navigate over to our default suite. And we could see that our job was successfully kicked off with a status code of 200, and it also returned that user ID that we're interested in. So we could use, in this case, user 1217 to go ahead and run scripts, and we'll make sure that we're testing the right thing. So that would be the last phase of our model where we're actually deploying this solution out to wider teams. So where is Tina at the end of her day? So she's been able to test data that the testing teams needed on time. She was also able to understand what data was present inside of her database and see where that sensitive data was located. She then used those synthetic generation functions to create data into the database, both through masking as well as a full synthetic test data generation. And lastly, she created a self-service form for her team to find and reserve the data they need on demand. She provided all of those resources so they can become more self-sufficient. And this really helps to speed up the testing process. And lastly, she just feels confident that she not only completed her task, but also contributed to the overall quality and safety of a company that she personally uses the services of. So I just want to take a pause here and open the floor up for any questions. I hope this demo was informative to you. And in the chat, we'd really like to start a discussion. So maybe as a starting point, we can see if there's any parts of this example that you see as a challenge for your organization. And I'll pass back over to Tom to help moderate that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Lena. And thank you, Ben, for the great presentation. So we have got a number of questions that have already come in. So thank you for those. If you have questions for Ben and Lena, please do get them into the chat. Just before we dive into the Q&A, I'd like to briefly flag to you, we've got a brand new test data certification program that Curiosity have brought out. This is all done online. It's entirely free of charge, and you'll get a certificate at the end, which you can share on your LinkedIn or anywhere else that you want. So we're currently, it's a new course, we're looking for new learners. If you'd like to participate, you should see an in-webinar poll right now. Just hit yes on that, and a member of our team will get in touch. So we'd love for you to take part in this free certification that we're running. If you want to continue your learning after today's session, there are also other ways you can do that. I would encourage you to book a meeting with a member of our team. Alternatively, you can contact Curiosity, and I'll send you links to do both of those things tomorrow. So I just wanted to flag that before we get into your questions. We've had a number come through, so thank you for that. I think probably if we start with this question from Nigel, thanks Nigel for the question. Maybe Ben, it's a good one for you. And Nigel's asking really about fundamental metrics that can be applied across different services and projects. What metrics can we use for measurement here?
Yeah, good question. So there's a few to watch out for as well. You really want to avoid vanity metrics, right? So there are some in this space, especially around coverage. especially around maybe the number of bugs or the amount of code that's being committed as part of a deployment, that sort of stuff you want to watch out for. But for me, some of the core ones are data preparation time, so understanding how long it takes to source, analyze, create or anonymize data. You want to understand that, because essentially for every project, every time there's potentially a release, or every time that data is used, you want to understand how long it takes you to either regather it or monitor it, that it's actually correct for your test, and therefore your test passes or fails because the data is good, and it doesn't, if it does fail, it's because there's a problem. Where possible, you understand the accuracy, completeness of your data quality. So you might have to tie that back to a requirement or to an expectation of what's required. Uniqueness in that sense is also quite a good one to understand. So, the quality or the coverage is maybe a better term for that. If you've got things like availability rates, so how often, your database or your environment is available, how long it takes to get up and in place, and those sorts of things. Those are probably a few key ones that you could start with and take a look at. Maybe as you progress, you can look into more of like the DORA metrics, like mean time to resolution and that sort of stuff as well. But I personally would start with the available, like the coverage side of things, your data coverage and your prep time. And based on that, you can then start to learn other things and baseline, what good or bad looks like.
Fantastic, thanks for that, Ben. And maybe if we go next to a question for you, Lena, which came up during your demo there when you were demoing data masking, so also from Nigel, and Nigel was asked really, the difference between masking and synthetic data. In the demo, it looks like you were applying some synthetic functions to mask the data. So is synthetic data really the same as masking, or where is the difference there?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Nigel. So it's essentially what I was trying to show is that synthetic test data generation is essentially applied to masking as well. So it's sort of the other way around. So in our full synthetic test data generation example, none of that data would be masked, but with masking, we're only applying synthetic test data generation to certain columns. So it's a mixture of real and fake data. So it's sort of a limited scope of synth data gen, while the other example I showed would be utilizing it across the entire table. So there would be no data at all in there that was originally in production.
Yeah, I'll just add to that because there's a second follow-up question. Tom, I think you were probably about to jump in. So it's more about sort of statistical information, like how do you represent data in your lower environments. I would say, just to add on to what Lena's saying there, masking, you can obviously, I don't want to say only, but you can only replace what is there. So if you've got people that exist there, masking allows you to update them and hide them away from who they are, so you can use them in test. Obviously, it maintains all the other information that exists, right? So depending on their whatever, their type of accounts or their their savings information, or I've got financial in my head. So that's all fine. Synthetic just then allows you to layer on top of that potentially additional information. So the profiling element of understanding your information, and then masking is one way to I guess control the security risk around that. Synthetic gives you the security, but it also then potentially gives you more flexibility in terms of maintaining that statistical information, your coverage levels. The goal, I would say, or one of the goals you should have, is that your test environments are worse than your production environments. And by worse, I mean they're much more covered in data, like your outliers of data, you have the option to do more. So you want them to be, a bit of a battlefield of different stuff that shouldn't maybe ever exist, but because you've been able to inject that using synthetic data, it does, and you can really robustly test your system. Production typically, hopefully, works, and therefore the interactions and the data that exists there can be quite similar. So you can have quite a narrow metric, whereas if you inject it with lots of production data, you might get a wider spread of things to really test that your system's able to handle the outliers that should never happen, but sometimes do, right? So hopefully, Ankit, that answers your question. It's a good question.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, and thanks everyone for those questions there. I guess slightly different pace of questions around sort of the types of systems we support, and particularly evidence asked around the Oracle Fusion apps on the cloud. So Oracle Fusion applications, a whole suite of business applications. You've got ERPs, you've got HCM or HR, you've got customer experience, a whole package of applications there. And other things, particularly asking about on the cloud whether what we've shown here is useful for doing end-to-end test data management against such applications.
It's a large question to tackle, but I would say, especially with end-to-end testing, a data management system is really important because you want to make sure that all of those relationships across each of those systems tie up, especially for ERPs, where you'll have a lot of customization, you'll have a lot of different implementations or potentially versions of different implementations as you're doing those things. I would also say in the background, typically, they're fed by databases and files primarily. Maybe some APIs, of course, that sort of try and manage some of those, some of the different relationships that exist. From our perspective, it goes all the way back to right at the beginning of the presentation, talking about that understanding. So it's more with Oracle Fusion or whatever it might be. What are you trying to do with it? Like, why is it important? And so on, and so on and so forth. As long as we can access that data, and sometimes getting access to the environments and to the databases or through the APIs, it really is it just depends, right? It just depends on who controls it, what do they want to do with it, what's the level of testing that's required. But I would 100% say you want a structured, organized system to be able to do it. You want to make sure that we automate as much of this as possible when it comes to the level of interaction between those systems. So data that gets put in one gets put in all of the ones that require it. And that can be really hard to manage without some sort of tool and, pretty pragmatic process in place. There's nothing about the Fusion apps that I would say overly worries me. It's more about the process that goes alongside it to make sure that you can do all the things that you want to do with it, right? And ultimately that end-to-end testing is of high quality, because that's, I guess, the goal.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And I guess, again, a slightly different type of question. This might also be one there. Ben, this came up when Lena was demoing around the self-service forms in particular, and somebody's asked how much time it takes the designer to create these different types of assets.
Good. That's a good question. That is a good question. I'm going to give you the wishy-washy answer, I'm afraid, which is it could be 5 minutes. It could be no time at all. It could be half a day, it could be a day. It just depends on the complexity of your system. So for example, we're just talking about injecting data into a one SQL database table that we've all got access to. Very straightforward, right? There's no technical debt or difficulty there. Are we trying to push data into a DB2 mainframe and we're trying to push it into a SQL database, an Oracle database, and make sure it's all referentially intact? Slightly more complicated, unless you have a tool that can do it. I was actually at a customer last week, and they were sort of averaging, I think, between about 4 to 6 hours for their jobs. And those were seriously complex. They weren't just sort of single table stuff. We're talking multiple instances across multiple environments. That was basically impossible. You probably could script 1 or 2 versions of that, but to maintain it and keep it and do it without, that's basically impossible. So I would say, for a basic job, let's maybe call it 2 hours. For a more complex job, let's call it 4 to 6. And if you're getting right into the weeds, you're trying to do some crazy stuff, then it's a little bit of wait and see. But once it's done once, it's done. That's reusable. That complexity and that investigation just drops off a cliff. So actually, anybody can go and request it and use it. So I would say it's worth the time, but that understanding is really important.
The one thing I would add to that too is that understanding your data up front, so kind of that first activity that I showed, will really lower the amount of time it takes to actually create the activity. I've often found when I'm working with customers that a lot of our time is actually spent in the first part or the first phase, where we're just trying to understand what sort of data they want to create, how it's all connected together. And once we've had that conversation, the actual building of the data is doesn't take nearly as long as that first part. So yeah, I echo Ben's estimations. I think they're spot on, but oftentimes I just find that the conversations and our initial planning really, that's where the ROI comes from.
Fantastic, thanks for that. And I guess maybe if I could circle out a bit larger than that question, right? So we're speaking there about creating particular assets, and Lena, I think you've indicated there that there's an ROI to the whole process, right? That whole roadmap that Ben you presented. You know, what would you say overall is a typical timeline and a typical ROI for that type of roadmap you presented there?
So it does vary, right? It will vary from place to place, of course. We see like there's some like over 70% efficiency gains at certain customers. It just depends how you slice it. So, you know, if we take an example, they're running 1,000 jobs a week. Those 1,000 jobs, some of them are basically impossible to do without a tool. Some of them are possible but hard to do, and some of them you could probably, you know, figure out with searching through the UI or, you know, going and digging out. So you sort of blend those rates together and find actually we have 2 incredibly complex jobs. We have 10 the jobs that are used quite a lot but are a bit easier, and then everything else is reasonably straightforward. You get to about 70% efficiency gain if you can automate those jobs or provide them in a self-service way. So you can then, you know, you can do the maths and work out, you know, depending on your time per hour or how often you're doing those data preparation tasks, how often you're doing releases, tie that back to tests that fail because the data's not right. You work out it probably takes about a week before you sort of your time in doing that understanding gets paid back to itself. So then you got another 51 weeks of the year to go and make progress, I guess.
Fantastic, thanks for that. And I guess then one last question there from my side, Joe. You tickled my fancy when you mentioned the Centre of Excellence earlier. And I suppose, do you typically recommend going down the test data Centre of Excellence route, or do you think it's best to have the skills and competencies distributed across an enterprise?
I would say we've done both. Lena, feel free to correct me if you think if you see other stuff with the customers you're working with. The pros of having a Centre of Excellence or a Centre of Practice, as some people call it, is it's a lot easier to get people to know where to go. So, you know, a lot of that's why I mentioned about sort of shouting about your achievements when you're doing something really positive, because a lot of people don't know that, you know, you might have set up this amazing COE around test data, and we can provide every sort of bit of data that you want as a tester, etc., and people don't know that it exists, I guess. So as long as you are not just doing good work but talking about it, presenting it, getting on your internal webinars, lunch and learns, and showing off a little bit, because otherwise it will just sneak under the radar. If you're able to just, you know, disseminate out into the wider practices and give them the tools and the skills to do it, that's also absolutely fine, but you will struggle to maintain the same standards, I think, because Team A is a greenfield team with very little technical debt versus Team B, who's dealing with a 40-year-old mainframe application. You've got 2 different problems, very different problems to solve. And so the benefits, but also how they go about their implementation will differ. And so you know, that's a bit of a non-answer, but I think depending on the size of the organization, depending on how often you're doing your data preparation, delivery, and all those, you know, releases, etc., will probably guide you down the route of COE or actually a wider service.
I would agree with that. And the only thing I would really add is that I've often seen that with Center of Excellences, it's really just the attitude that the people inside of it take, where it's not just up to them to own excellence or quality across the organization. It's really everyone's responsibility. And I don't mean that in a harsh way, but kind of in an inspiring way, where we're all contributing to this larger goal. And that helps to create this mindset of we're all really trying to help each other, versus maybe like InfoSec is not keen on doing this new process. They want to keep it the same. But then if we view it as all working together, it just helps you move in the right direction. So whether or not you're doing that in a centralized or distributed way, just working together, knowing you have the same like positive outcome in mind, I've seen that be really helpful, like universally across every customer I've worked with.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And thanks really everyone for getting your questions in. We're coming up on time here, so we're going to wrap up for today. So I think what remains to be said is a massive thank you to Ben, massive thank you to Lena for the great presentation, to everybody who's joined. As I say, there will be some follow-ups. We'll send you a link to the recording. We'll send you the slides. There's also going to be a post-webinar poll, and please do take the 30 seconds to do that. It would be great to get your feedback. There's also an option there if you wanted to schedule a follow-up meeting with a member of the Curiosity team, you can let us know. And I can see that a large number of you do want to undertake the free test data certification. In the post-webinar poll, you'll have another chance to let us know that you do want to do that if you missed that first poll that went out 10 minutes ago or so. So please do fill in the poll. Massive thank you for joining. Thanks to everybody who came with the questions. And Ben, Lena, a huge thank you to you both for the great webinar there.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers.